Imagine your friend group didn't just stay friends, they conquered the entire world. That's exactly what happened to 13 boys from ancient Macedonia. By the time they were 30, these childhood friends controlled an empire stretching from Greece to India, 22 million square miles of pure domination. We're talking about more territory than the Roman Empire at its peak, more wealth than entire civilizations combined, and more power than any group of friends has ever wielded in human history. But power would test their bonds in ways they never imagined. Love would turn to jealousy, loyalty would become betrayal, and friendship would end in murder. This is the untold story of history's most legendary squad, and how they literally conquered everything, then destroyed each other. But first, let me blow your mind with this fact. These weren't just random teenagers with big dreams. They were handpicked by the greatest military genius of the ancient world, Philip II of Macedon. And here's what's insane. Philip didn't choose them for their royal blood or their family connections. He chose them because they were absolutely fearless. Picture ancient Macedonia in 350 BC. It's a rough, mountainous kingdom that the sophisticated Greeks considered barbaric. While Athens had philosophers and Sparta had warriors, Macedonia had something different, the most elite cavalry unit the world had ever seen. The companion cavalry wasn't just an army, it was a brotherhood. And at the center of this brotherhood was a teenage prince named Alexander, surrounded by his 12 closest friends. Let me introduce you to the squad that would reshape civilization. First, Hephaestion, tall, handsome, and Alexander's absolute best friend since childhood. Some say they were lovers, others insist they were just incredibly close. What everyone agrees on is that Alexander trusted Hephaestion more than anyone alive. Then there's Cletus the Black, older, scarred from battles, and fiercely protective of Alexander. This man would literally take a sword for the prince without hesitation. Ptolemy, possibly Alexander's half-brother, brilliant strategist, and the quiet schemer who saw 3 moves ahead of everyone else. Perdiccas, the ultimate loyal soldier, commanding the foot companions with iron discipline and unwavering devotion to Alexander. Cassander, son of Macedonia's regent, ambitious, intelligent, and secretly resentful of Alexander's rise to power. He smiled and obeyed, but jealousy burned in his heart. Craterus, the traditional Macedonian warrior who believed in the old ways and distrusted foreign influences. Antigonus One Eye, a grizzled veteran who lost his eye in battle but never lost his fighting spirit. Seleucus, the empire builder who dreamed of ruling vast territories in the east. Lysimachus, the survivor who would outlast most of his friends and carve out his own kingdom. Leonidas, the glory seeker who craved fame and recognition above all else. Pethan, the administrator who understood how to turn conquered territories into functioning provinces. And finally, Nearchus, the naval commander who would sail uncharted seas for Alexander. These boys didn't just dream of glory, they swore sacred oaths to each other in the ancient Macedonian tradition. They would conquer together, rule together, share the spoils of victory, and never let anything break their bond. They mixed their blood in a ceremonial cup and drank from it, sealing their friendship for eternity. But making oaths is easy. Their first real battle would prove if friendship could survive when death was coming at them from all directions. Then something happened that changed everything. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, 18-year-old Alexander led his friends in a cavalry charge that would make military history. But this wasn't just another battle. This was their graduation from boys to warriors, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The enemy was the sacred band of Thebes, 300 elite warriors who had never been defeated in battle. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were pairs of lovers who fought side by side, believing that no man would show cowardice in front of his beloved. They were legendary, unstoppable, and about to face a group of Macedonian teenagers. Picture the scene: a massive battlefield with 40,000 Greek warriors, preparing for the fight that would determine the future of Greece. Alexander's father Philip commanded the main force, but he gave his 18-year-old son control of the companion cavalry, and with it, the most dangerous assignment on the battlefield. Alexander looked at his 12 friends, mounted on their war horses beside him. Hephaestion flashed his confident smile. Cletus gripped his spear with scarred hands. Ptolemy studied the enemy formations with calculating eyes. These boys were about to charge into legend or die trying. The moment came. Alexander raised his spear and let out the Macedonian war cry. 13 friends thundered across the battlefield toward the most feared warriors in Greece, their horses' hooves shaking the earth beneath them. But here's what's absolutely insane about this charge. It wasn't just military tactics. As they crashed into the sacred band's flank, these friends fought not just for Macedonia, but for each other. When Alexander's horse stumbled and threw him into a mass of enemy spears, it was Cletus who immediately wheeled his mount around and charged back into the melee. "I've got your back, brother," Cletus reportedly shouted as he took a spear thrust meant for Alexander's heart. The bronze point ripped through his armor, but he didn't fall. Instead, he grabbed the enemy warrior and literally threw him off his horse. Hephaestion appeared on Alexander's other side, his sword cutting down 2 Theban warriors in quick succession. Ptolemy and Perdiccas formed a protective circle around their friend. This wasn't just a cavalry charge. It was 13 boys, proving they would die for each other. In the chaos of battle, something extraordinary happened. The sacred band, the invincible warriors who had dominated Greek battlefields for decades, began to break. Not because they lacked courage, but because they had never faced anything like the Macedonian companion cavalry. These weren't just individual warriors. They fought as one mind, one heart, one unstoppable force. When the dust settled, the sacred band lay dead to a man. They had chosen death before retreat, just as their tradition demanded. But standing over their bodies were 13 Macedonian friends, bloodied but victorious, having achieved the impossible. The Battle of Paranoia wasn't just a Macedonian victory, it was validation. The barbarian kingdom had just defeated the greatest military powers of Greece. And at the center of that victory were 13 friends who had proven their bond in the crucible of war. But their first real test of loyalty was still coming, because 2 years later, Philip would be assassinated at his own daughter's wedding, and Alexander would inherit a kingdom on the brink of collapse, with enemies on every border and rebellions brewing in every city. Here's where it gets interesting and controversial. When 20-year-old Alexander became king in 336 BC, half of Greece erupted in rebellion. The Thebans declared independence. The Athenians celebrated Philip's death in the streets. Persian spies were spreading gold to anyone willing to fight Macedonia. Most kings would have trusted experienced generals, seasoned politicians, or family members. Alexander trusted his friends, and one friend above all others, Hephaestion. Ancient sources describe their relationship in terms that make modern historians debate furiously. Hephaestion was Alexander's second self, his alter ego, the person who shared his tent, his secrets, and quite possibly, his bed. When Alexander's mother Olympias sent him letters criticizing his decisions, he would read them aloud to Hephaestion. When Persian nobles offered tribute, Hephaestion stood beside the throne as an equal. But was it romantic love or just the deepest friendship in history? The ancient sources are maddeningly unclear. What we know for certain is that Alexander trusted Hephaestion with his life, his army, and his empire in ways that no other person, not even family, ever experienced. However, Hephaestion wasn't the only one in the inner circle. Ptolemy, who may have been Alexander's illegitimate half-brother, possessed a strategic mind that could see patterns others missed. While Alexander dreamed of conquest, Ptolemy thought about logistics, supply lines, and how to actually govern the territories they conquered. Perdiccas commanded the foot companions with absolute loyalty. He never questioned Alexander's orders, never showed doubt, never wavered in his devotion. If Alexander had told him to march into the sea, Perdiccas would have asked how deep. Craterus led the traditional Macedonian forces and believed in the old ways, Macedonian customs, Macedonian values, Macedonian superiority. He loved Alexander, but distrusted foreign influences and changes to their traditional way of life. Antigonus, despite losing an eye in battle, remained fiercely devoted and possessed an almost supernatural ability to hold territory once it was conquered. Seleucus dreamed of ruling vast eastern territories and had an intuitive understanding of how to manage diverse populations. Then there was Cassander, the son of Alexander's regent Antipater. Unlike the others, Cassander had never sworn those childhood oaths. He had been forced into the circle by political necessity, and in his heart, jealousy grew like poison. He smiled, he obeyed, he fought alongside them, but he secretly believed he would make a better king than Alexander. These weren't just military commanders, they were a family forged in battle. When Alexander decided to cross the Hellespont and invade the Persian Empire in 334 BC, he wasn't just launching a military campaign. He was embarking on the greatest adventure in human history, with his 12 best friends by his side. But here's what they didn't know. Conquering an empire is easy compared to ruling one. And the Persian Empire they were about to face wasn't just the richest civilization on earth. It was a culture so sophisticated and seductive that it would test every bond they had sworn to each other. What happened next defies belief. In just 4 years, from 334 to 330 BC, 13 friends conquered the entire Persian Empire, the largest, richest, most powerful civilization on earth. We're talking about defeating Darius III, who commanded over 1 million soldiers and controlled territories from Turkey to Afghanistan. But here's the genius part that most people don't understand. Alexander didn't conquer to rule alone. He gave his friends kingdoms, actual kingdoms. This wasn't just sharing the spoils of war. This was making his childhood friends into pharaohs and kings. Let me paint you a picture of just how insane this was. After the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, when they crushed Darius's main army, Alexander called his friends together in the captured Persian royal tent. Imagine this scene: 13 young men, most still in their 20s, sitting on Persian carpets worth more than entire Greek cities, dividing up the known world. "Ptolemy," Alexander said, "Egypt is yours." Just like that, his friend became pharaoh of the most ancient civilization on earth. The same Egypt that had built the pyramids, that controlled the grain supply for the Mediterranean, that possessed libraries containing all human knowledge. Seleucus, you get Babylon and everything east of it. Babylon, the city of Nebuchadnezzar, with its hanging gardens and ziggurats, plus territories stretching to the Indus River. Seleucus was now richer than most kings had ever dreamed of being. Antigonus, Asia Minor is yours to govern. An entire subcontinent, with cities like Troy and Sardis, controlling trade routes between Europe and Asia. The list went on. Perdiccas got command of the royal army and effective control of the empire's heartland. Craterus would govern Macedonia and Greece. Leonidas received territories in Asia Minor. Lysimachus got Thrace and the northern territories. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about this arrangement. They were doing this based on friendship, not family ties or political marriages. Your typical ancient empire was held together by blood relationships, arranged marriages, and hostages. Alexander's empire was held together by childhood oaths and personal loyalty. The numbers are staggering. The Persian royal treasury at Persepolis contained 40,000 talents of gold. That's equivalent to over $800 million in today's money. And that was just one treasury. They captured dozens of them. The combined wealth under their control made them collectively richer than entire civilizations. Ptolemy's Egypt alone generated enough wealth to fund massive building projects, maintain the largest library in the world, and support a population of millions. Seleucus's territories controlled the Silk Road trade routes, making him wealthy beyond imagination. These friends had gone from Macedonian nobles to the richest, most powerful men on earth. But success would bring out their darkest sides. Because as Alexander started adopting Persian customs, wearing Persian clothes, demanding Persian-style prostration, marrying Persian nobles, his friends began to question everything they thought they knew about him. Was this still the boy who had sworn sacred oaths with them? Or had the intoxicating culture of the East transformed him to something else entirely? The first cracks in their friendship were about to appear, and they would be caused by something none of them had anticipated: the seductive power of Persian civilization. Then Alexander made a series of choices that horrified his friends and shook the foundations of everything they believed in. It started small, wearing Persian royal robes instead of Macedonian armor. Then it escalated, demanding prostration where visitors had to bow down and worship him like a Persian god-king. To understand why this was so shocking, you need to understand Macedonian culture. Macedonians were warriors who believed in equality among companions. Kings were first among equals, not gods. The idea of a Macedonian groveling on the ground before another Macedonian was absolutely repulsive to them. "We didn't conquer Persia to become Persian," Cletus the Black reportedly argued in a heated private meeting with the other companions. "We came here as Macedonians, and we should rule as Macedonians." But Alexander was falling in love with Persian culture. He married Roxana, a Bactrian princess of extraordinary beauty. He started speaking Persian in court. He adopted Persian administrative practices and began favoring Persian nobles over his Macedonian friends in certain positions. Picture the growing tension in the inner circle. Hephaestion, as always, supported Alexander completely. "If Alexander believes Persian customs will help us rule this empire more effectively, then we should trust his judgment," he would say in council meetings. But others were deeply troubled. Craterus openly opposed the Persian adoptions and demanded that Alexander remember his Macedonian heritage. Cassander saw an opportunity. If Alexander alienated his Macedonian base, perhaps there would be room for new leadership. The real shock came when Alexander discovered what he believed was a conspiracy against his life. Philotas, the son of Parmenion, one of Philip's oldest friends, and Alexander's most trusted general, was accused of knowing about a plot but failing to report it. Alexander didn't just execute Philotas after a show trial. He sent assassins across the empire to murder Parmenion, a 70-year-old man who had served Alexander's family faithfully for over 30 years. Parmenion was killed while reading a letter he thought was from Alexander. Instead, it was his death warrant. Picture the absolute horror on the faces of Alexander's friends when they learned what had happened. If Alexander could kill Parmenion, a man who had been like a father to him, a man who had won dozens of battles for Macedonia, what would he do to them if they opposed him? The paranoia was spreading. Cassander, who had always resented Alexander, began secretly corresponding with his father Antipater back in Macedonia, sharing his concerns about Alexander's increasing tyranny. Ptolemy started making independent decisions in Egypt, ostensibly for administrative efficiency, but really to protect his own position. Even Hephaestion, Alexander's most loyal friend, privately began to worry. Ancient sources suggest he tried to moderate Alexander's behavior, to remind him of their childhood oaths and the bonds that had brought them so far. But the sacred bonds of friendship were cracking under the weight of absolute power and cultural transformation. The 13 friends who had sworn to conquer the world together were slowly becoming strangers to each other. The breaking point was coming, and it would happen at what should have been a celebration dinner with friends. A night that would end with murder and destroy their brotherhood forever. What happened on that night in Samarkand in 328 BC still gives historians chills. It was supposed to be a celebration. Alexander had just conquered another rebellious city, and victory called for wine, stories, and brotherhood. The 13 friends, now reduced to 12 after various deaths and departures, gathered in Alexander's tent for what should have been just another night of friendship. But this wasn't going to be just another night. Tensions had been building for months, and wine has a way of making people say what they really think. The evening started normally enough. Alexander, dressed in Persian royal robes that glittered with gold and jewels, reclined on a couch in the Persian style. His friends were arranged around him, some on couches, others on cushions. Persian servants brought wine, not the watered wine Greeks typically drank, but pure Persian wine that hit like a sledgehammer. As the night wore on and the wine flowed, conversation turned to their conquests. Alexander began boasting about his achievements, comparing himself to the heroes of legend. This was normal. Warriors often boasted about their deeds. But what Alexander said next crossed a line. He began diminishing his father Philip's accomplishments, suggesting that his own conquests were far greater than anything Philip had achieved. He also started praising Persian military tactics and Persian culture, suggesting they were superior to Macedonian ways. That's when Cletus the Black, the man who had saved Alexander's life at Chaeronea, had heard enough. Cletus was older than the others, a veteran of Philip's campaigns, and he was drunk enough to speak his mind. "You've forgotten who you are, Alexander," Cletus allegedly shouted across the tent, his voice cutting through the music and laughter. "You sit there in Persian clothes, surrounded by Persian customs, talking about Persian superiority. Have you forgotten that Macedonian blood won you this empire?" The tent went dead silent. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward Alexander, waiting to see how he would respond to this unprecedented challenge from one of his oldest friends. Alexander's face flushed red with wine and anger. "Cletus, you forget yourself. I am your king, not some drinking companion from our youth." But Cletus wasn't backing down. Years of watching Alexander adopt Persian ways, years of seeing their Macedonian heritage dismissed, years of accumulated resentment came pouring out. "King? You're hardly the king your father Philip was. Philip conquered Greece with Macedonian courage and Macedonian tactics. You conquered Persia by standing on the shoulders of the men he trained. And now you want to be worshipped like some Persian god king? Your father would be ashamed." The words hung in the air like poison. Alexander rose unsteadily to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. He was dressed for dinner, not battle. "How dare you?" Alexander's voice was barely controlled rage. "Everything I've achieved through my own genius, my own courage. Philip gave me nothing but a bankrupt kingdom and a handful of barbarian soldiers." That's when Cletus made his fatal mistake. He laughed, a bitter, mocking laugh that echoed through the tent. "Your own genius? Look around you, Alexander. Every man in this tent has bled for your glory. We've conquered your empire. We've saved your life a dozen times over. And what thanks do we get? You dress like our enemies and spit on our traditions." Alexander was beyond rational thought now. In a moment of blind, drunken fury, he grabbed a spear from one of his guards and hurled it with all his strength directly at his childhood friend. The spear struck Cletus in the chest with a sickening thud, piercing his heart. The man who had saved Alexander's life at Chaeronea, who had stood by him through every battle, lay dying on the floor of what should have been a celebration. The tent erupted in chaos. Some friends rushed to Cletus's side, but it was too late. He was dead within moments. Others stared in shock at Alexander, who seemed to suddenly realize what he had done. Alexander looked at the spear in his hands, then at his dead friend, then at the horrified faces of his remaining companions. The magnitude of what he had just done hit him like a physical blow. "What have I done?" he whispered, and screamed it. "What have I done?" Ancient sources say he tried to turn the spear on himself, screaming in anguish about murdering his friend and guardian. His remaining companions had to physically wrestle the weapon away from him and restrain him from committing suicide. For 3 days after that night, Alexander refused food or water, consumed by guilt and horror over what he had done. He lay in his tent, alternately weeping and raging, calling out Cletus's name and begging forgiveness from the gods. The 13 friends were now 11, and trust would never be the same. Every remaining companion now knew with absolute certainty that Alexander was capable of murdering his closest friends in a moment of rage. The boy who had sworn sacred oaths with them was gone, replaced by something darker and more dangerous. But the worst betrayal was yet to come. Because in just 4 years, Alexander would lose the one person he loved most in the world, and his reaction would finally convince his friends that their childhood companion was truly gone forever. Then fate delivered the cruelest blow of all, and it came for the one person Alexander loved more than life itself. In 324 BC, in the ancient city of Ecbatana, Hephaestion, Alexander's best friend, his second self, possibly the love of his life, suddenly fell gravely ill and died. The circumstances surrounding Hephaestion's death remain mysterious to this day. Some ancient historians believe he was poisoned by jealous rivals who resented his influence over Alexander. Others suggest he died from excessive drinking during a festival. Still others claim he succumbed to a fever that swept through the army. But here's what we know for certain. Hephaestion's death wasn't just the loss of a friend, it was the destruction of Alexander's soul. To understand the magnitude of this loss, you need to understand what Hephaestion meant to Alexander. They had been inseparable since childhood. When Alexander became king, Hephaestion became his second in command. When Alexander adopted Persian customs, Hephaestion supported him completely. When other friends questioned Alexander's decisions, Hephaestion remained loyal. Ancient sources describe their relationship in language that suggests deep romantic love. They shared the same tent, the same dreams, the same vision of empire. When Alexander's mother Olympias wrote critical letters, he read them aloud to Hephaestion. When Persian nobles brought tribute, Hephaestion stood beside the throne as an equal. The Persian queen mother, when she first met Alexander and Hephaestion, bowed to Hephaestion because he was taller and more regal looking. When told she had made a mistake, she was reportedly embarrassed, but Alexander said, "You made no error, mother. He too is Alexander." So when this man, this other half of Alexander's soul, died suddenly in Ecbatana, Alexander's reaction went beyond grief into complete madness. First, he executed Hephaestion's doctor for failing to save his friend's life. Then he ordered the largest funeral pyre in ancient history, a massive structure costing 12,000 talents, equivalent to over $2 billion in today's money. But that was just the beginning. Alexander ordered that Hephaestion be worshipped as a god in temples throughout the empire. He commanded that no one else could ever bear the name Hephaestion. He had the sacred fire at the temple of Ammon extinguished until Hephaestion was properly honored. Most heartbreaking of all, Alexander declared that when he died, he wanted to be buried in the same tomb as Hephaestion. They conquered the world together. Witnesses reported him saying through his tears, and they should rest together for eternity. But Alexander's grief took darker forms as well. He launched a brutal campaign against the Caucaeans, a mountain tribe that had done nothing wrong, simply because he needed to kill something to ease his pain. Thousands of innocent people died because Alexander couldn't bear his loss. The remaining friends watched in horror as their once great leader spiraled into depression, paranoia, and increasingly erratic behavior. This wasn't the Alexander they had grown up with, the friend who had sworn sacred oaths with him. This was a broken man whose capacity for love had died with Hephaestion. Cassander, who had always resented Alexander, now openly mocked his grief in private conversations with other companions. "Look at our great king," he reportedly said, weeping like a woman over his dead boyfriend. Ptolemy, always the pragmatist, began making careful preparations to secure Egypt for himself. If Alexander was becoming unstable, Ptolemy needed to protect his own position and his own people. Even Craterus and Perdiccas, who had remained loyal through everything, began to worry about Alexander's mental state. The man who had conquered the known world was falling apart, and the empire was starting to fragment as a result. 8 months after Hephaestion's death, Alexander himself died in Babylon. The official cause was fever, but many suspected poison. Some historians believe he died from grief, that losing Hephaestion had broken something fundamental inside him that could never be repaired. Others suggest that Cassander or other disaffected companions finally decided that Alexander had become too dangerous to live. The boy king who had conquered the world with his friends was dead at 32, and the greatest empire in history was about to tear itself apart. But here's the most tragic part. Alexander died believing that most of his friends had abandoned him. The sacred bonds forged in childhood, tested in battle, and celebrated in victory had been destroyed by power, cultural conflict, and the ultimate tragedy of loss. The empire the 13 friends had built together was about to become their battlefield. What the surviving friends did next was both genius and inevitable. With Alexander dead, his infant son too young to rule, and no clear succession plan, the greatest empire in history was up for grabs. The men who had conquered the world together were about to fight each other for the pieces. They met in Babylon for what would become known as the Partition of Babylon. Picture this scene. 10 childhood friends, now in their 30s and 40s, Sitting in the same throne room where they had celebrated their greatest victories, preparing to divide up Alexander's empire like an inheritance dispute. But this wasn't just any inheritance. This was the known world. Ptolemy spoke first, and his words would echo through history. Alexander is dead, and his empire dies with him. What we built together as friends, we must now rule separately as kings. The division that followed was masterful in its pragmatism. Ptolemy took Egypt, the richest and most defensible territory. He had always been the strategic thinker, and he knew that Egypt's natural borders and wealth would make it nearly impossible to conquer. Seleucus claimed the eastern territories, Babylon, Syria, and everything stretching to the Indus River. This was the largest portion by land area, encompassing multiple cultures and peoples, but Seleucus had always dreamed of ruling vast territories. Antigonus took Asia Minor and immediately began plotting to reunite the entire empire under his rule. Of all the companions, he was the most ambitious and the least willing to accept a divided empire. The other survivors carved out their own kingdoms. Lysimachus got Thrace, Craterus took Macedonia and Greece, Leonidas received territories in Asia Minor, and Cassander eventually maneuvered himself into control of Macedonia after Craterus died. But here's what makes this division absolutely incredible. Despite everything that had happened, the murders, the betrayals, the cultural conflicts, they managed to create a relatively stable arrangement that lasted for decades. These men understood each other in ways that no one else could. They had shared experiences that no other group of people in history had ever shared. They knew each other's strengths, weaknesses, and ambitions with perfect clarity. The result was the Hellenistic period, 300 years during which Greek culture, language, and ideas spread across the known world. Ptolemaic Egypt became a center of learning and culture, with the great library of Alexandria becoming the intellectual heart of the ancient world. The Seleucid Empire spread Greek ideas and trade networks from Turkey to Afghanistan, creating cultural exchanges that would influence civilizations for centuries. Even Cassander, the eternal schemer, proved to be an effective ruler of Macedonia, rebuilding cities and maintaining stability in the Greek heartland. But the wars weren't over. The wars of the Diadochi, the wars of Alexander's successors, would rage for 40 years, as various friends and their descendants fought for supremacy. Yet here's what's remarkable. Despite the conflicts, despite the bloodshed, despite all the ways power had corrupted their relationships, their legacy lived on through their descendants. Ptolemy's dynasty ruled Egypt for 300 years. His descendant was Cleopatra herself. Seleucus's empire lasted for over 2 centuries. The cultural fusion they created between Greek and Eastern civilizations produced art, philosophy, science, and literature that still influences us today. So what can we learn from Alexander's 13 friends? That friendship can conquer the impossible, but power destroys everything it touches. These boys proved that with absolute loyalty, you can literally reshape the world. But they also showed us that no bond, no matter how strong, can survive unlimited success. Their story asks the real question. When you get everything you ever wanted, do you still remember the people who helped you get there? Or do they become threats to protect your success from? We see it everywhere today. Business partners becoming enemies, friend groups destroyed by money, loyalty tested by fame. Alexander's friends just did it on the biggest stage in history. They conquered the world together, but lost each other forever. Their legacy? The greatest achievement and the greatest tragedy, proving that sometimes the price of winning everything is losing everyone. What do you think? Is any success worth destroying your closest friendships? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more stories where history reveals the darkest truths about human nature.